Title: The Unseen Presence. Chapter 1. The Move. The setting sun, pale and bruised, stretched its fingers across the horizon. Its fading light bled into the pale yellow and grey of the road that had, for the last several hours, led Sarah and David farther into the heart of nowhere. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay as their car, an old sedan they had owned for years, hummed against the long, straight stretches of countryside road. It wasn't just the journey that unnerved Sarah. It was the quiet, the deep, oppressive silence that seemed to have swallowed everything around them. No birds, no insects. Not even the wind dared to stir the trees as they drove past. "Do you think we're making a mistake?" Sarah asked, her voice soft but edged with doubt. Her fingers gripped the door handle, and her knuckles whitened in the dim light. The road seemed endless now, and in her gut, something gnawed at her, a visceral feeling of dread that she couldn't shake. David, ever the optimist, glanced at her, his lips curling into the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I don't know, Sarah. This place, this house, it's a fresh start. We've been talking about it for months, remember?" He spoke with a warmth that couldn't dispel the heaviness in the air, but he tried anyway, his hand instinctively resting on the wheel. The house had been a dream. An old farmhouse tucked away in a quiet part of the country, secluded, far from the noise and stress of city life. It had all the charm of an old, forgotten memory, and Sarah had been eager to escape the chaos that had defined their city life. But now, as they passed through the narrow country road, it felt less like a dream, and more like a descent into something strange and unsettling. A place that had been untouched, forgotten, perhaps for a reason. Her fingers traced the window pane, the glass cool against her skin as the landscape outside blurred into motion. Rolling hills that seemed to stretch on forever, vast fields of dying grass. The occasional house that looked abandoned, as if long ago swallowed by time. There was no turning back now. This was it. The old house. It was their future. Or at least, it was supposed to be. "Look, Mom!" Emily's excited voice pierced through the fog of Sarah's thoughts. Sarah glanced back to see her 6-year-old daughter pressed against the window, her wide eyes drinking in the view. Emily had always been the adventurous one, her spirit light and playful, never deterred by the fear that gripped Sarah's heart now. Her blonde curls bounced with every movement as she pointed excitedly at the landscape. "There it is! I see it!" Emily's voice rang out with an innocent joy that made Sarah's heart ache. She looked up, and there, just beyond the bend in the road, stood the house. The house. The one they had pored over in photographs for months, the one they had carefully chosen from a dozen others. It was a sprawling 2-story farmhouse, its white exterior faded with time and neglect, the windows dark and blank as if holding secrets behind them. Vines snaked up the walls, and the roof sagged in places, as though the house had simply given up its fight against the years. But there it stood, waiting. And though Sarah knew it was supposed to be their sanctuary, it looked more like a forgotten relic, abandoned and lost in the folds of time. David pulled the car into the gravel driveway, the tires crunching against the pebbles as the car came to a stop. The engine died, leaving only the sound of the wind, whispering softly through the surrounding trees. The house loomed before them, still and silent, as if it were observing them. Sarah shivered involuntarily, rubbing her arms against the sudden chill that had crept over her skin. David opened his door and stepped out, his boots scraping against the gravel as he walked toward the house, seemingly unbothered by the weight of the silence. He moved with purpose, carrying boxes from the back of the car without hesitation, but Sarah lingered for a moment, sitting still in her seat, staring at the house. Her fingers still gripped the edge of the door, and she couldn't shake the thought that something wasn't quite right. Her eyes wandered across the house, tracing its worn-out edges, the faded shutters, the long-forgotten porch. It looked abandoned in a way that no one had mentioned before. It wasn't the quaint farmhouse she had dreamed of. There was something off. "Sarah, you coming?" David's voice called from the open front door of the house, his figure framed by the darkness within. He didn't seem to notice the tension that seemed to hang in the air, the way the house felt like it was holding its breath. Or maybe he didn't care. This was their new beginning. Sarah glanced at Emily in the back seat, who was now eagerly climbing out of the car with a bright smile. Emily always had the ability to see the world as a playground, a place of adventure where nothing could hurt her. But Sarah wasn't so sure. As she took one last look at the house, she couldn't escape the feeling that it was waiting for them. But waiting for what? She opened the door and stepped out, her boots sinking into the gravel. She forced a smile for Emily's sake, though the unease had not abated. It lingered in the pit of her stomach, growing steadily as she walked toward the house, the sound of her footsteps heavy in the otherwise silent air. The door creaked open, its hinges groaning in protest as David disappeared inside. The house smelled of dust and mildew, an earthy, old scent that hit Sarah as soon as she crossed the threshold. The interior was dim, lit only by the soft, fading light of the afternoon. The air inside felt thick, heavy, as if it too had been waiting for their arrival. The wooden floors groaned under their weight as Sarah followed David into the living room. Emily, ever the curious one, ran ahead, her laughter echoing through the rooms. "Mom, look at this room! It's huge!" Sarah smiled faintly, her gaze drifting across the large living room. The walls were adorned with faded wallpaper, the floral patterns long lost to time. The windows, though large, were dusty and dirty, and the once bright curtains hung limp, as though they had not been drawn in years. The furniture, old mismatched chairs and a sagging sofa, seemed to have been left behind in a rush, as if the last occupants had fled without warning. David moved toward the kitchen, his footsteps echoing through the house. "It's got character, Sarah," he said again, though this time, his voice lacked the confidence it had held before. His words felt forced now, as if he too had begun to question the house's welcoming demeanor. Sarah lingered in the doorway, her eyes tracing the cracks in the walls, the faded lines of what had once been family portraits. Something about it all felt wrong. Too wrong. The house wasn't just old, it was haunted by memories. Memories that had long since faded from the surface, but still clung to the walls, buried deep beneath layers of dust and decay. And then she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the faintest whisper of movement from upstairs. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. She looked up at the staircase, its dark banister stretching up into the shadows, the steps lost in darkness. A shadow flickered at the top of the stairs, but when Sarah looked again, it was gone. David noticed her hesitation and turned, following her gaze. "What's wrong?" Sarah opened her mouth, but no words came. Instead, her eyes narrowed, her heart pounding in her chest. She had seen something, but what? The house. It was watching her. "Nothing," she finally muttered, shaking off the feeling. She forced herself to smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm just tired. Let's get settled in." David nodded, but he didn't look convinced. He watched her for a moment longer before heading into the kitchen. Emily, oblivious to the tension, bounded up the stairs, her laughter echoing down to Sarah like the sound of a child lost in a dream. But Sarah didn't follow. Not yet. Instead, she stood there, rooted to the spot, her gaze fixed on the shadowed staircase. The house seemed to hold its breath, as though it too were waiting for something to happen, waiting for them to make their choice. Chapter 2. The Shadows Whisper. The sun dipped lower beneath the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched across the yard like skeletal fingers. Inside the house, the air was stagnant, heavy with the smell of old wood and dust. The once inviting scent of the countryside had faded the moment they had crossed the threshold. Now, the house smelled of something older, as though it had been untouched by human presence for decades, its breath long stilled by time. Sarah stood at the window of the living room, her eyes unfocused as they scanned the landscape. The trees swayed gently in the wind, their leaves brushing the earth in a whispering rustle. But there was something more, something deeper beneath the rustling. The house wasn't just quiet, it was waiting, watching. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but something in the stillness gnawed at her. David had already started unpacking their things, organizing the mismatched furniture into the living room. But Sarah couldn't bring herself to join him. Every time she tried, a heaviness settled over her chest. The weight of an unseen presence. She shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. It was just the house, she told herself. just the unfamiliarity of it all. Emily, full of energy as always, ran from room to room, her laughter filling the silence. It wasn't that Sarah didn't appreciate Emily's joy. It was just that the house didn't seem to respond to it the way it should. The silence remained, thick and oppressive, even when the child's laughter echoed through the rooms. She glanced around the room, the old walls seeming to close in on her. The wallpaper was peeling in places, the faded floral patterns barely visible under the grime of years. Dust coated everything. Even the air seemed heavy, thick with the memories of whoever had lived here before. It wasn't the charming rustic farmhouse she had envisioned. It felt abandoned, decrepit, like the house had a secret it wasn't ready to share. A soft creak came from upstairs. Sarah stiffened, her breath catching in her throat. The stairs. She hadn't been up there yet, had avoided them since they arrived. The heavy wooden staircase seemed to beckon her, pulling her toward the second floor. Something told her to stay away, to resist the pull. But something else, something darker, urged her to go up, to see what lay hidden behind the closed doors and cobweb-covered frames. She walked slowly to the base of the stairs, her feet hesitant against the creaky floorboards. The house seemed to grow quieter the closer she came, as though the very air was holding its breath. She reached out and touched the banister. It was cold, colder than she had expected. The wood felt brittle beneath her fingers, as if it could break at any moment, sending the whole house crashing down on her. The house groaned, a deep rumbling sound that came from somewhere beneath the floor. Sarah stopped, her heart thudding in her chest. It wasn't the house settling. She had heard that noise before, the familiar creak of an old building adjusting to the weight of time. But this was different. It was as though something was moving beneath her feet, something that wasn't supposed to be there. Her pulse quickened as the shadow stretched across the floor, reaching for her. She turned and glanced behind her at the empty living room. She was alone. David and Emily were nowhere to be found. The house had swallowed them whole, just as it seemed to have swallowed her thoughts, leaving her with nothing but a growing sense of dread. A soft whisper, barely audible, came from above. It wasn't English. It wasn't even a language she recognized, but it felt familiar, comforting, in an unsettling way. A voice from another time, another place. Her eyes snapped back to the stairs, but they were still empty. No one stood at the top. Still, the whisper echoed through her mind, growing louder with each passing moment. "Mom!" Emily's voice startled Sarah from her reverie. She spun around to see her daughter standing in the doorway of the living room, her wide eyes filled with innocence. "What are you doing?" Sarah blinked, trying to clear her head. She hadn't even realized she had stepped halfway up the stairs. Her hand still gripped the banister, her knuckles pale with tension. Just looking around," Sarah replied, forcing a smile, though her voice was shaky. "Why don't you come down here with me?" Emily hesitated for a moment, then nodded and came running down the stairs, her small feet making the wood creak with each step. "I found something cool upstairs," she said, grinning. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. "What did you find?" she asked, her voice betraying the concern that had taken root in her heart. Emily grinned, her eyes shining with excitement. "I found an old box. It has pictures in it, and some other stuff. I think it's from when the people lived here before." The words sent a ripple of unease through Sarah. The house had been abandoned for so long. Why hadn't anyone come to take the things left behind? And why would Emily be the first to find them? "We should leave it alone for now," Sarah said quickly. "Come on, let's go get something to eat." But Emily didn't seem to hear her. Her eyes were fixed on the staircase. "Mum, someone's upstairs. I think I saw them." The blood drained from Sarah's face. She turned, half expecting to see someone standing there in the shadows, their face obscured by darkness. But there was nothing. Just the empty staircase, creaking softly under the weight of time. "Emily," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's no one upstairs. It's just an old house, okay?" But even as she spoke, she knew it wasn't just an old house. It was something else, something ancient and forgotten. And it was alive. They ate dinner in silence. The house seemed to grow darker as the evening wore on. The air felt thick with the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes, watching from every corner, from every shadow. Sarah tried to shake the feeling, to convince herself that it was just her imagination running wild, but she couldn't. It wasn't just the house that unsettled her. It was something inside of her. A whisper at the back of her mind that told her something was wrong. Something was coming. David didn't seem to notice. He was too busy unpacking, too busy trying to make everything feel normal. He had always been the optimist, the one who could see the silver lining, even in the most troubling of circumstances. Sarah had always admired that about him, but now she wasn't so sure. The house seemed to feed on the tension between them, the distance that had grown between them over the years. She felt it now, like an invisible weight pressing on her chest. Later that night, after Emily had fallen asleep on the couch, Sarah found herself awake, staring at the darkened ceiling. She had tried to sleep, to shake off the fear that clung to her, but it was impossible. The house was too quiet, too still. She could hear the softest of sounds, the faint whisper of something moving behind the walls, a skittering, like something crawling beneath the floorboards. Suddenly she heard a sound that froze her blood, the faintest of footsteps, soft, deliberate, as if someone were walking in the hall. No, it wasn't just someone. It was something that wasn't supposed to be there. Sarah sat up in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped right outside her bedroom door. Then, the softest of knocks came, like the sound of someone's knuckles brushing against the wood. She barely dared to breathe, her body frozen in terror. The door creaked open slowly, inch by inch. "Mum?" It was Emily's voice, soft and sleepy. But there was something in her tone, something that didn't belong. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she turned to see her daughter standing in the doorway, her figure bathed in the pale light from the hallway. But this was not Emily. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Walls. The night had come, but the darkness inside the house felt thicker, more tangible than any night Sarah had known. The silence pressed in on her, wrapping her in a heavy cocoon that made it difficult to think, let alone breathe. The old farmhouse had its own pulse, its own rhythm, as though it had been alive long before they had ever set foot inside. And now it had begun to stir again. Sarah lay awake, her eyes wide open, staring at the faint outlines of the ceiling above her. The faint moonlight that filtered through the cracked window only served to amplify the shadows in the room. They seemed to move, slowly at first, as though they had a mind of their own, stretching and shifting across the walls, curling around the furniture like dark fingers. She didn't know what time it was anymore. The minutes had melted into hours, and the house had become an entity unto itself, timeless, restless, unrelenting. It had a way of creeping into your thoughts, making every noise seem like an omen, every shift in the air a sign that something was wrong. The house was awake, and it had noticed her. Sarah swallowed hard and turned to face the other side of the bed. David was there, asleep as peacefully as he always was. He never seemed to notice anything strange about the house. He couldn't hear the creaking floorboards, the whispering walls, the distant echoes of voices that seemed to call out to her from behind closed doors. His sleep was deep, undisturbed. But Sarah couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching them both. It was only a matter of time before it made itself known. The soft, rhythmic ticking of an old clock somewhere in the house, she wasn't sure where, drifted through the silence. Tick-tock, tick-tock. It was maddening in its steadiness, as though time itself was counting down to something she couldn't quite grasp. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the noise, but her mind kept racing. She kept thinking about the whispers, those strange, indistinct sounds that had begun to slip through the walls and floorboards. They were faint at first, almost imperceptible, but now they were louder, clearer. She could hear them every night, always at the same time. Whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sometimes they sounded like a conversation between strangers. Other times, they were just words she couldn't make out, as if they were speaking in a language that didn't exist. But tonight was different. As the clock ticked on, the whispers grew more distinct. They weren't just muffled voices anymore. They were clear, almost too clear. She could hear them now as if they were right next to her. And one thing stood out from all the others. A name she recognized, a name she had never wanted to hear again. Sarah. Her breath caught in her throat. It was her name, whispered with a chilling familiarity. Not her husband's voice, not her daughter's. It was something else, something cold, distant, and wrong. She wanted to move, to scream, to wake David, but her body wouldn't respond. It was as if the very air around her had turned to stone, holding her down, suffocating her. She held her breath, waiting for the next whisper, the next sound. But it didn't come. Instead, there was a sound behind her, a soft shuffle of footsteps, slow and deliberate, just outside the bedroom door. Her heart slammed against her chest. It was impossible. Emily was asleep on the couch downstairs. David was next to her. There was no one else in the house. Yet the sound was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was standing just outside the door. She lay there, frozen, her skin prickling with a cold sweat. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get up and flee, but she couldn't move. The silence was oppressive, smothering her in its grip. The footsteps stopped, just outside the door. A low, guttural sound emanated from behind the door, like the sound of nails scraping against wood, the unmistakable sound of something, or someone, scratching at the door. Sarah. Her name again. It was closer this time, as though the thing that had been whispering from the shadows had somehow gotten closer, much closer. She couldn't take it anymore. With all the strength she could muster, she shoved herself out of bed, her feet landing on the cold wooden floor with a sharp, echoing thud. She grabbed the bedside lamp, clutching it in her trembling hand like a weapon, and stumbled toward the door. The house groaned as if it were waking up along with her. The walls trembled beneath her feet, and the floor creaked with each step she took. The door. It was closed. It had always been closed. But now, something had changed. The door was slightly ajar, just a crack, a sliver of darkness beckoning her in. Her heart was a drumbeat in her chest as she approached, her breath shallow and quick. She reached for the door handle, but it felt too cold, colder than it should have been. The metal was slick with frost, as if winter had taken root inside the house. With a deep breath, Sarah pushed the door open. The hallway was empty. Nothing was there. Nothing, except for the shadows, which seemed to gather and swell, growing more oppressive with every breath she took. She scanned the hallway, her eyes searching every corner, but the only sound was her own racing heartbeat, pounding in her ears. Her mind was telling her to go back to bed, to wake David, to get out of the house. But something kept her rooted to the spot, a strange compulsion, as if the house itself was calling her deeper inside, urging her forward into the unknown. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it, a shadow, barely perceptible, flickering across the wall. It was quick, too quick to be anything natural, but there was something familiar about it, something human. Her body froze, her mind screaming at her to look away, to close her eyes and retreat. But she couldn't. She couldn't pull herself away. The shadow flickered again, closer this time, moving in a jerky, unnatural way, like a marionette tangled in its strings. "Mom?" A voice, sweet and innocent, called out from behind her. Sarah spun around so fast she nearly lost her balance. There, standing in the doorway to the living room, was Emily. Her small face was pale, her eyes wide with something that Sarah couldn't identify. Fear, yes, but something else, something darker, something that had no place in her daughter's innocent gaze. "Emily, what are you doing up?" Sarah's voice was strained, her throat tight. But Emily didn't respond. She just stood there, silent, her gaze fixed on Sarah, her expression frozen in an odd mix of fear and curiosity. And then, before Sarah could speak, the door to the living room creaked open on its own, revealing the dark hallway beyond. The shadows seemed to crawl out from the cracks in the walls, stretching and writhing toward them. Sarah could feel them. Thousands of eyes, all watching, all waiting. And in that moment, she knew the house had been waiting for them. Chapter 4. The house's hunger. The next day arrived with an unnatural stillness. The house seemed to breathe in time with Sarah's pulse, a quiet, insistent rhythm that echoed through her bones. As morning light filtered in through the cracks in the curtains, it only served to illuminate the shadows that had deepened overnight. No matter how much sunlight poured into the house, it never felt quite bright enough. The shadows clung to the corners, to the walls, curling around the furniture like a living thing. Sarah stood at the kitchen counter, her hands trembling as she set the kettle on the stove. The whistling of steam was the only sound that filled the space, but even that felt wrong. Too sharp, too insistent, like a cry from deep within the house, calling out to her. She glanced at the clock. It was already past 8, but David still hadn't woken up. Emily, too, was silent, no longer running through the house with her usual energy. It was as though the house had taken something from them, something vital, something that had left them sluggish, hollowed out, each step echoing with a silent emptiness. The silence grew oppressive, wrapping itself around Sarah like a tight cloak. She tried to shake it off, tried to focus on the mundane task of making breakfast, but her mind refused to settle. Every sound seemed amplified, each creak of the floorboards, each flicker of the overhead light, each small noise from the other rooms, and the whispers. They were no longer confined to the night. They had spread throughout the day, lingering just beyond her hearing, growing louder with every passing minute. Sarah. The sound was soft, distant, but it was unmistakable. Her name, slipping through the walls like an invitation or a warning. She forced herself to turn away from the kettle and head for the stairs, each step heavier than the last. The air seemed to thicken the further she went, as though the house itself was pressing down on her, urging her to stay. But she couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. When she reached the top of the stairs, she paused. The hallway stretched before her, an empty, yawning void. The rooms were all closed, the doors locked. She glanced down at Emily's bedroom door. It was ajar, just enough to make her stomach twist with unease. She pushed the door open, but the room was empty. The bed was made, the floor clean. Nothing was out of place. And yet, there was a lingering sense that something had shifted in the air, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to leave. Her mind raced. Where was Emily? Had she gone outside? Had she wandered off in the night? A voice, so faint she almost thought it was a figment of her imagination, whispered from somewhere below. "Come closer, Sarah." Her skin prickled, her heart leaping into her throat. It wasn't her mind playing tricks. It was the house. The house was calling to her again, its hunger insatiable, pulling her deeper into its grasp. She turned and walked toward the end of the hall, her footsteps slow and deliberate, as though the floor beneath her was shifting, threatening to swallow her whole. The house groaned, the walls quaking as though they were settling into a new, more sinister position. The walls wanted her to feel its presence, to understand that it was no longer a guest in her home. It was the master. She reached the attic door. The air grew colder as she touched the brass doorknob, which felt impossibly cold to the touch. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, vibrating through her chest. "It's waiting for you. It's waiting for you, Sarah." Her heart hammered in her ears as she pushed the door open. The attic loomed before her, a dark, oppressive space filled with dust and forgotten memories. Old trunks, broken furniture, and the remnants of lives once lived were scattered across the floor. The beams overhead seemed to sag under the weight of the house's unspoken secrets. She stepped inside, and immediately the air seemed to grow thicker, heavier, as though she was sinking into something dark and suffocating. The floor creaked beneath her, but she forced herself to move forward, toward the farthest corner of the attic. There, tucked away behind a stack of old blankets and discarded furniture, sat a small, weathered trunk. Something about it drew her in, a magnetic pull she couldn't ignore. The whispers had stopped, and for a moment, the house itself seemed to hold its breath. She knelt before the trunk, her fingers trembling as she fumbled with the latch. It was stiff, stubborn, but finally, it gave way. Inside, the smell of old paper and decaying wood rushed out to meet her, filling her nostrils with the musty scent of forgotten history. The trunk was filled with papers, old letters, and photographs. But there was something else. A small yellowed book bound in cracked leather, its surface worn by time. She picked it up carefully, her hands shaking. The book felt heavier than it should have, its pages thick and brittle, like the secrets of the past had been trapped inside, waiting to be released. She opened the book. The words inside were written in a language she didn't recognize. Strange symbols, twisted and looping, seemed to dance across the page, flickering in the dim light. Her eyes couldn't quite focus on them, as if the very act of reading them would tear open some rift in reality. But the more she tried to ignore them, the more insistent they became. Sarah. The name echoed in her head again. But this time, it wasn't the house whispering to her. It was the book. It was calling her. She could feel it now. The pull, the hunger, deep within the walls of the house, growing stronger by the second. It had been feeding on her fear, on her uncertainty. And now it wanted more. It wanted everything. Suddenly the air turned frigid, the temperature dropping so quickly that Sarah's breath fogged in front of her. The floor beneath her feet trembled as the walls seemed to close in, the shadows swallowing everything in their wake. The whispers rose again, this time louder, more frantic. You should have never come here. She slammed the book shut and backed away, her heart racing. The attic door was still open, but it might as well have been 1,000 miles away. She reached for it, but the shadows seemed to move with her, twisting and turning, blocking her path. They were closing in, pulling her deeper into the house's insatiable hunger. The whispers weren't just voices anymore. They were claws, scratching at her mind, at her very soul. The attic door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Her scream caught in her throat as she turned back to face the trunk, but it was gone. The room was gone. The walls closed in around her. The shadows wrapped themselves around her like tendrils, choking her breath. She was alone. But then, she was not. Chapter 5. Echoes in the Dark. The following night was worse than Sarah could have imagined. The house had become something entirely different. No longer merely a place of shelter or comfort. It was now a sentient entity, hungry and aware, its very walls pulsating with an unrelenting force. It was alive with whispers, with unseen movements, and a gnawing sense of something watching, waiting. Sarah could feel it in every corner, in every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. The house had turned on them, and nothing would ever be the same again. She had hoped it was just a nightmare, a fleeting moment of madness, but as the sun set and the shadows began to stretch across the rooms, she realized it wasn't. Whatever had taken hold of the house, whatever dark force had awakened, was now entrenched in every inch of the place. She stood at the kitchen counter, staring blankly at the untouched plate of food in front of her. Her hands trembled, and for a moment, she felt as though the very air had thickened, becoming heavier with every passing second. The kitchen light flickered erratically, casting eerie shadows that seemed to slither across the floor, curling around her feet like fingers. A deep, unsettling silence settled in the house. No more creaks, no more whispers. It was as though the house was holding its breath, preparing for something. She could feel the anticipation building in the air. A knock at the door. It was faint at first, a gentle tapping that might have been mistaken for the wind. But as it grew louder, more insistent, Sarah's heart began to race. She froze, unable to move, her breath caught in her throat. The knock came again. This time, harder, more deliberate, as though something on the other side of the door was trying to get in. Her pulse quickened. Who could be at the door at this hour? With trembling hands, Sarah slowly made her way to the door. Each step felt like it took an eternity. The knocking continued, growing louder and more desperate, until it was a cacophony in her ears, drowning out everything else. She reached for the handle. The door swung open by itself. There, standing in the doorway, was nothing. An empty space. No person, no figure. Just the cold darkness of the night beyond. A breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced to make sense of it. Had someone been standing there? Had someone knocked? But there was no one. Nothing. Just the thick, suffocating darkness. The shadows behind her stirred, as if drawn to the door. She could feel them. Feel their presence. rising up from the corners of the room like tendrils of smoke, curling around her ankles, her legs, trying to pull her into the abyss. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She slammed the door shut, but it did nothing to silence the growing sense of dread that filled the air. The house was closing in around her, and the walls felt smaller, tighter, as though the very structure was shrinking, suffocating her. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the silence. Soft at first, a whisper carried on the wind. Sarah. Her name. It was unmistakable, but it was not David, not Emily. This voice was different. It was deep and guttural, like something from the depths of the earth itself, something ancient and malevolent. Sarah. Come closer. She turned toward the hallway. The air grew colder, thick with the unmistakable stench of decay. The hallway seemed to stretch before her, longer than it had ever been. The shadows twisted and writhed, reaching out toward her like claws. She had to move. She had to leave, but her feet were frozen in place. The whispers returned, louder this time, surrounding her. Sarah. The temperature dropped even further. Her breath fogged in front of her, and she felt an intense pressure on her chest, as though something was pushing down on her, trying to suffocate her. The walls groaned, and the house seemed to come alive with an unbearable hunger. Something was wrong. No, something had always been wrong. Sarah stumbled back into the living room, her mind whirling, trying to grasp what was happening. The furniture was rearranged. The chairs and tables that had once felt so familiar were now turned askew, their legs tilted at odd angles, as though the house itself had decided to mock her. In the corner of the room, a figure stood. It wasn't David. It wasn't Emily. The figure was tall and gaunt, its features obscured by shadow. The figure was draped in tattered rags, the edges of its clothing moving like they were caught in an invisible wind. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The figure stepped forward, its feet dragging across the floor with an unnatural sound, like bones scraping against stone. The figure moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, each step sending a shiver through Sarah's spine. It spoke, its voice low and hollow, as though it had not used its voice in centuries. I have been waiting for you. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the floor, her hands gripping the edge of the couch as she tried to steady herself. Her mind raced, but no matter how hard she tried to think, the words, the images, they wouldn't make sense. The house was changing. The world outside was slipping away, and something worse was creeping in. The figure's face, or what might have once been a face, was covered by a veil of shadow. It moved closer, and Sarah could feel the coldness emanating from it, a chill that seemed to sink deep into her bones, freezing her from the inside out. The figure raised a hand. Its fingers were long, unnaturally long, and they scraped the floor with a sickening sound as it extended its arm toward her. Sarah. It whispered again, and this time it was not a voice. It was something deeper, something inside her head, inside her very being, invading her thoughts. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The room grew smaller, darker, as though the walls themselves were closing in, suffocating her in the presence of this thing, this entity that had been waiting for her. Her vision blurred, the house seemed to tilt, as if she were falling into a void. And then, just when she thought she could no longer take it, a sudden sharp pain shot through her chest. She gasped, clutching at her heart, her body shaking uncontrollably. The figure's hand was just inches from her, and she could feel its icy touch creeping up her arm, sending waves of freezing terror through her body. Let me show you. The words echoed in her mind, louder now, as the figure's face began to emerge from the shadows. It was no longer just a veil. It was a shifting, twisting mass of darkness, as if 1,000 faces were trying to emerge from it, each one worse than the last. And then she saw it, the house she had once called home. It was alive. It had always been alive, and it had been waiting for her and her family, for as long as she could remember. It had fed on them. It had taken their joy, their hope, and now it was ready to take their souls. Sarah screamed as the world around her collapsed into darkness, as the walls closed in, suffocating her in its hunger. But it was too late. The house had won, and she would never escape. Chapter 5. Echoes in the Dark. Continued. The figure loomed over Sarah, its presence more suffocating than the thick darkness surrounding her. Every breath she took felt labored, as though the very air itself had been poisoned by this entity, this thing that was no longer bound by any rules of nature. It was beyond time, beyond reason, and it was here, in her home, in the very space she had once thought was safe. She tried to push herself up, her arms trembling beneath her weight, but the coldness from the figure's touch had spread throughout her entire body, freezing her muscles. It was as if her very blood had turned to ice. She couldn't move, couldn't escape. The figure's face emerged fully from the shadows, revealing what could only be described as a mask of nightmares. It was not human, nor was it anything she had ever seen. The skin was pale, stretched thin over the skull, the eyes dark pools of emptiness, devoid of any warmth or empathy. The mouth, though closed, was stretched into a grotesque grin, one that seemed too wide to be real, as though the face had been unnaturally distorted. "It's not you I want," the voice whispered again, not from the figure, but from all around her. It reverberated inside her skull, seeping into her very soul. "Not yet." Sarah's breath hitched as a wave of terror washed over her. She couldn't comprehend what it meant, but she could feel the presence growing stronger. The house, the walls, the air, everything seemed to hum with a strange, malevolent energy, as though it were alive, feeding on her fear. The figure reached out once more, its hand hovering above Sarah, a grotesque silhouette against the dim, flickering light. It lowered its fingers slowly, deliberately, until they brushed against her forehead. The touch was cold, colder than any winter night, and it burned through her skin, searing into her mind. Images exploded in her consciousness. Visions of places she had never been, faces she had never seen, fragments of memories, some familiar, others foreign, flashed before her eyes in a disorienting whirl. A child's laughter echoed, followed by a woman's scream, muffled as if coming from far away. The walls seemed to close in tighter with each image, each sound, until she could barely breathe. She couldn't tell if they were memories or if they were something else, something the house was showing her, something that had been waiting for her all along. Her eyes shot open as the vision stopped, leaving only the overwhelming sensation of the thing's presence. The figure was standing over her now, its face impossibly close, its breath like a deathly wind on her skin. "You think you can escape?" the voice hissed. "You think you can hide from me? From us?" Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, her throat tight with terror. She wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself staring into the abyss of the creature's eyes, and for a moment, just a fleeting moment, she felt her mind start to unravel. She could see the truth, feel the horrifying weight of it pressing against her chest. The house was never just a house. It was a trap, a prison, and it had been waiting for her. The thing stepped back, as if granting her some small mercy, but Sarah felt no relief. The air around her felt heavier, thick with an oppressive darkness that threatened to swallow her whole. She couldn't think, couldn't process, as her mind teetered on the edge of madness. "This is only the beginning," the voice whispered again. "Soon you will understand." A sudden crash echoed through the house, breaking the silence, and Sarah's head snapped toward the sound. It came from upstairs, from the room that had once been Emily's. She felt the hair on the back of her neck stand on end, her pulse quickening. It was the same crash she had heard before, the sound of something heavy falling. But this time, it was different. There was a malicious intent behind it, a deliberate force, as though something was deliberately trying to rattle the house, trying to push her into a corner. Her body screamed for her to run, but she couldn't. The figure's presence was still looming in the room, its energy suffocating and unyielding. With every breath she took, she felt as if she were breathing in the dark, the very air around her thick with an oppressive weight. But the crash from upstairs, there was no denying it. It was real. It was happening. Sarah knew she had to go. She had to face whatever it was, whatever had been calling her. With a struggle, she pushed herself to her feet, her legs weak, but still, she forced herself to move. Each step felt like it took every ounce of her strength. She could feel the darkness closing in behind her, following her like a predator, but she refused to stop. She reached the staircase, her hand gripping the railing as she ascended slowly, every step feeling like it could be her last. The walls seemed to stretch endlessly, as if they were growing taller, pressing down on her. The temperature dropped with each movement until her breath came out in visible puffs, a sharp contrast to the heat rising in her chest from the panic that refused to abate. The crash had stopped, but the house wasn't silent anymore. It was alive with noises, scratching sounds, faint whispers, the unsettling creak of doors opening and closing on their own. Her pulse raced, and her heart seemed to beat in time with the ominous sounds echoing through the house. As she reached the top of the stairs, the shadows in the hallway seemed to move, as though they had been waiting for her. The air grew thick, oppressive, and Sarah felt herself being pulled forward, drawn toward the room at the end of the hall. It wasn't just the room Emily used to stay in anymore. No, it had become something else, something darker, more dangerous. The door was ajar, a sliver of darkness beyond it. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer, unable to look away from the opening. The air felt electric, charged with a palpable malevolence, and then she heard it, the faintest sound. A voice, but not Emily's, not David's. It was a low, guttural whisper, one that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. "Come closer." Her body tensed, but something inside her pushed her forward. It was as if her own will had been ripped away, replaced by an overwhelming need to see what lay beyond that door. She stepped into the room. It was cold, colder than it had ever been before. The walls seemed to shimmer with a strange, sickly light, as though the very fabric of the room was twisting, warping. In the corner of the room she saw it, the figure, standing motionless in the shadows. But this time, it wasn't alone. There, at its feet, lay the remains of something broken and twisted. And she knew, with sickening clarity, that it was her. "You've come home," the voice whispered again, and Sarah felt herself fall to her knees, her mind unraveling as the truth hit her like a tidal wave. This house had never been her home. It had never been anyone's home. It was a prison, a tomb. And now it was ready to claim her chapter 6, a fractured silence. Sarah's feet moved like they were tethered to the ground, each step forward a monumental effort, as if she was sinking deeper into the house's darkness with every breath she took. Her pulse thudded in her ears, louder than the whispers, louder than the creaking of the floorboards beneath her. Her thoughts spun, disjointed and fragmented, like pieces of glass scattered on the floor, each one sharp, dangerous, and out of place. The room before her was a void, its edges blending into the shadows like ink dissolving in water. The only light came from the flickering bulb above her head, its glow dim, sickly, like a dying star in a sky of eternal night. Her breath misted in the frigid air, and the temperature in the room had dropped so low that she could feel the chill sinking deep into her bones. Her teeth chattered despite her best efforts to stay calm. The door creaked open just enough for her to pass through, its hinges groaning under the strain, as though even the house itself was resisting her entry. The darkness inside felt alive, pulsating with some strange, malevolent energy. It was a feeling Sarah had come to know intimately in the past days, an overwhelming sense that something was watching, waiting, and that every moment she lingered was one step closer to being consumed by whatever force had taken root in this house. She stepped inside, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The floor beneath her creaked with every movement, as if the house itself were groaning under the weight of its secrets. She couldn't see much of the room at first, just the outline of furniture draped in white sheets, their edges curling like the remnants of forgotten ghosts. It felt wrong. It felt as though these things should not be here, that they had no place in this house, but somehow they belonged. A sudden flash of movement from the corner of her eye made her freeze. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat, but there was nothing. Just the dark corner of the room, empty, silent. She exhaled slowly, willing herself to relax. It was nothing. Her mind was playing tricks on her, again. But even as the thought passed, she knew it wasn't true. The house had never felt like this before. The shadows were too deep, too persistent. The silence was too thick, as if the air itself were holding its breath. Her footsteps faltered as she moved deeper into the room. She could see now that the furniture was covered in dust, the sheets long turned yellow from age, the corners of the room thick with cobwebs. But it wasn't the dust or the cobwebs that held her attention. It was the painting on the wall. The moment she saw it, she knew something was wrong. Her breath caught in her throat, and her chest tightened. The painting was old, very old, but it wasn't the age of the painting that disturbed her. It was the faces. There, in the frame, were figures. 3 of them, a family. A man, a woman, and a child. The man had sharp features, a harsh expression, and dark eyes that seemed to gleam with an unnatural light. The woman standing beside him was beautiful, but her face was gaunt, almost skeletal, and her eyes were wide, too wide, as though they were looking at something beyond the painter's vision. And the child, her face was blank, expressionless, staring out from the canvas with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce straight through Sarah. The room seemed to grow colder as she stared at the painting. The weight of those hollow eyes pressing down on her, she could feel something shift within the room. A subtle change, like a gust of wind moving through the darkness. But there was no wind, no breeze, only that suffocating stillness. She took a step back, then another, unable to tear her eyes away from the scene before her. And then, as if from nowhere, she heard it. A sound, faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone. It was like a plea, a desperate cry that sent a chill racing down her spine. "Help us!" The whisper was barely audible, but it was there. It was real, and it came from the painting. Her heart began to race, panic blooming in her chest. She needed to leave. She needed to get out of this room before the house consumed her completely. But her legs refused to obey, rooted to the spot as though some invisible force held her there, anchored to the very ground beneath her. "Help us, please!" The whisper grew louder, clearer, but still it was not a voice she recognized. It was more of a plea than anything else, a desperate, mournful cry that echoed from within the canvas itself. Sarah turned away from the painting, the overwhelming sense of dread clawing at her chest. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't be near it. But as she moved to the door, her eyes flicked back toward the corner of the room where she had seen movement earlier. Something was there. A figure stood in the shadow, its form barely visible, but she could see it now. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with limbs too long, too thin. Its skin was pale, stretched tight over the bones, and its eyes were black as the void itself. The figure was watching her, its head tilted to one side like a predator sizing up its prey. Sarah froze, her mind racing for an explanation, but she could find none. There was no explanation. There was only the reality before her, a reality she could no longer deny. She turned toward the door, but the figure moved, its motion swift, jerky, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. It blocked her exit, standing tall in the doorway, its eyes gleaming with malevolent intent. "You can't leave." The voice came from the figure now, but it wasn't a voice at all. It was a thought, a presence that invaded her mind, wrapping around her like a vice. It wasn't speaking to her. It was in her, suffocating her thoughts, stealing her will. "We have been waiting for you." The words were not just spoken. They were felt, like a heavy weight pressing down on her chest, forcing the air from her lungs. Sarah's knees buckled, and she fell to the floor, gasping for breath as the room seemed to close in on her. The figure loomed over her, its presence overwhelming, its form stretching impossibly tall until it seemed to fill the entire room. "Help us!" The whisper came again, but this time it was louder, more insistent, echoing through Sarah's mind like a broken record. "Help us!" The figure reached down, its long, twisted fingers grazing her shoulder. The cold from its touch burned through her skin, a fire that spread through her veins like ice. "You are part of us now." Sarah's vision blurred, her thoughts slipping further into the darkness. She tried to scream, but the words caught in her throat, unable to escape. The room spun around her, the walls closing in, the shadows growing thicker, darker. The figure was all around her now, its presence consuming every inch of the room. And then, just as quickly as it had all begun, the room fell silent. The figure was gone. The whispers were gone. The house, the air, the very walls seemed to hold their breath, waiting. Sarah lay still, her body trembling, her mind racing. What had just happened? Had it been real? Or was it all a hallucination? The room was silent now, the figure gone. But Sarah knew, she knew deep down, that the house had just claimed her. And she was not alone. Chapter 7. The weight of the forgotten. The air in the house felt thicker than it had the day before, like it was made of something solid, something ancient, something that had been forgotten by time but not by memory. Sarah could feel it press against her skin, seeping into her very bones, infecting her thoughts with the same invasive dread that seemed to settle in every corner of the decaying mansion. Every step she took felt like an echo of something long past. Every breath a reminder that she was not alone. The hallway stretched out before her like the maw of a beast, its darkness alive, pulsing with an energy that was both alien and familiar. She couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in around her, as though the house itself was breathing, its ancient heart beating in time with her own. The whispers, those faint voices that haunted her every step, were growing louder again, reverberating in the silence like a distant call. She had tried to ignore them, tried to block them out, but they seemed to be growing more insistent, crawling into her mind, seeking entry. She paused at the end of the hallway, her fingers tracing the cold, peeling wallpaper. The design was faded, barely visible beneath layers of dust and grime, but Sarah could still make out the faintest outlines of once beautiful roses, their petals now wilted and torn by time. She had seen this wallpaper before. She was sure of it. But where? When? A sudden chill ran down her spine as a memory, distant and fragmented, slipped into her mind. The roses. They weren't just a pattern. They were something else, something alive. Or at least they had been once. She couldn't quite grasp the memory, couldn't quite place it, but she could feel its weight, its presence, pressing in on her. Sarah drew a shaky breath, steadying herself. The house was playing tricks on her. She knew it was. Her mind was unraveling, losing grip on the present as the shadows of the past reached out to claim her. But even as she tried to rationalize the sensation, the fear gripped her heart like a vice. She couldn't deny it. There was something in the house, something that had been waiting for her, waiting for someone to walk through its halls, to awaken it from the slumber it had endured for so long. She moved forward, her steps hesitant but determined, and found herself standing before the door at the end of the hall. It was closed, unremarkable, just another door in the endless maze of this forsaken place. But there was something about it, something that made her hand hesitate just above the brass doorknob. The whispers seemed to come from behind the door now, faint and unintelligible, but unmistakably there. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned the knob and pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound reverberating through the house like a scream. The room beyond was bathed in shadow, the dim light filtering through the thick curtains drawn tightly over the windows. The air was heavy with dust, the stale scent of neglect, and something else, something foul, like something rotting. She stepped inside, the door groaning closed behind her, and froze. The room was not empty. There, at the far corner, a figure stood motionless, staring at her with unblinking eyes. The figure was tall, thin, impossibly gaunt, its limbs stretched and elongated like some grotesque mockery of humanity. The skin was pale, almost translucent, and its face, if it could even be called a face, was a hollow, empty void, like a mask torn apart by time. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It simply stood there, watching her. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, her body frozen in place by the sheer terror that flooded her veins. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream. But her legs refused to obey, rooted to the floor by some invisible force that held her captive in the presence of the creature. For what felt like an eternity, the room was silent. The figure did not stir. But Sarah could feel it. Feel its gaze burrowing into her soul, pulling at her with invisible threads. She could hear the faintest whispering again, this time clear, as if it were speaking directly to her mind. "You shouldn't have come." The words were not spoken aloud, but Sarah heard them as though they were ringing in her head. the voice thick with malice and ancient sorrow. She tried to look away, tried to break free from the grip the figure had on her mind, but it was impossible. The words continued to reverberate, growing louder, more insistent, until they drowned out all other sounds. "You shouldn't have come." The door behind her slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. The room plunged into darkness. And then, as if summoned by the very darkness itself, the whispering grew louder, more frantic, echoing in every corner of the room, in every crevice of her mind. "Help us. We are here. We have always been here." The air grew cold again, colder than before, and Sarah could feel the temperature drop in an instant, as if the very essence of the room had shifted. She clutched her arms tightly around herself, trying to ward off the chill, but it was no use. The darkness pressed in closer, suffocating her, until she could no longer see the figure. She could only feel it, its presence surrounding her like a living nightmare, closing in with every breath. The whispers grew louder. They were no longer just words. They were thoughts, emotions, raw and primal, pouring into her consciousness like a flood. "You are the one. You are the key." Her heart raced, her pulse thudding in her ears. She had to leave. She had to escape, but the door wouldn't open. The room wouldn't let her go. The whispering intensified, a chorus of voices now, overlapping, rising in pitch until it was a deafening roar, a cacophony of agony and despair. Sarah felt herself being pulled toward the center of the room, her feet dragging against the floor, her body moving as though controlled by forces beyond her understanding. She stumbled forward, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps, her mind a blur of fear and confusion. She reached out for something to hold on to, anything to break the pull of the darkness, but there was nothing. Just the oppressive weight of the shadows, the suffocating blackness that seemed to devour everything in its path. And then, in the heart of the room, she saw it. A mirror. It was standing tall against the far wall, framed in dark wood, its surface smooth and reflective. But the reflection wasn't her own. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light. The figure in the mirror was distorted, its features warped. But then she saw the eyes. The eyes were the same as the figure she had seen in the corner of the room. But they were not just watching her, they were looking through her. And that's when Sarah realized. The figure in the room wasn't the only one trapped here. She was too. The realization hit her like a slap to the face. The whispers, the pressure in the room, the overwhelming feeling of being suffocated. It wasn't just the house, it was them, the ones who had been waiting for her. The ones whose voices had followed her from the moment she stepped inside. The house was not just a building, it was a prison, and she was its latest prisoner. The figure in the mirror began to move. Its limbs jerked, unnaturally, and it reached toward the glass. The darkness in the room seemed to deepen, swirling around her like a storm, pulling her toward the mirror. "Help us!" The whisper came again. But this time, it wasn't a plea. It was a command, and Sarah was powerless to resist. Chapter 7. The Weight of the Forgotten. Continued. The mirror's surface rippled like disturbed water, its reflection growing more distorted with every passing second. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the figure within the glass, the same twisted entity she had seen in the corner of the room, reached out to her with impossibly long fingers. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. The limbs were too thin, too frail, like something that had withered and decayed, yet still moved, still existed, driven by an ancient force. Her feet were frozen to the ground, her body locked in place by a terror that she couldn't escape, couldn't outrun. The mirror's reflection had become a portal, an entrance to something far darker than she had ever imagined. She could see it, the creature, pulling itself from the mirror's depths, its long, gnarled fingers curling around the edge of the frame. The whispers were deafening now, rising to a crescendo in her mind. The voices seemed to come from everywhere, surrounding her, pressing in, until she could no longer tell where they began and where they ended. They were all around her, in her ears, in her skull. "You're ours now." The voice was deeper, darker, purer in its malevolence. It made her insides twist, her stomach churn with something far worse than fear. It was the voice of a predator, of something that had been waiting for a long time, watching, patient, biding its time until she finally entered. With a horrifying crack, the mirror shattered. For a split second, Sarah's heart stopped. The glass split into shards, scattering across the room, reflecting fractured versions of herself. The room, the house, everything around her seemed to fragment, the edges of reality bending and warping as the darkness swelled. But then she felt it, a presence, a weight, something pulling her, dragging her toward the shattered mirror, toward the very spot where the figure had reached through. Her hands shook violently as she tried to push herself away, her body fighting against the invisible force, but it was no use. The room was no longer her own. It had become something else, a place where time had no hold, where nothing obeyed the laws of the natural world. The floor beneath her feet felt alive, breathing, shifting as if it had its own desires. "Help us!" The words came again, the plea now unmistakably urgent. They were not coming from the creature. They were coming from the shattered pieces of the mirror, the fragments that glistened like daggers in the darkness. As Sarah looked into each one, she saw more than just reflections. She saw glimpses of others, faces, eyes, people trapped just like her. Their mouths moved silently, their faces contorted in agony, their hands reaching toward her, begging for release. The room was filling with something darker now, something that pressed in on her, crushed the air from her lungs until she could barely breathe. Her heart pounded in her chest, but even that rhythm felt alien, as though her very essence was being swallowed by the house. A low, guttural growl rose from the darkness, somewhere near the broken mirror, and Sarah turned her head toward it instinctively, though she knew it was a mistake. The creature was close now, almost tangible, its foul breath filling the air around her. She could hear its bones crack as it moved, unnatural, brittle, like a puppet dragged across the floor, and then, from behind her, a whisper. "Turn around." The voice was low, a hiss that vibrated through her bones. It was familiar, but twisted. It sounded like her own voice. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. "Turn around, Sarah. It's here. It's waiting." Without thinking, without understanding why, she obeyed. Her eyes locked onto the reflection in the largest shard of the broken mirror. What she saw there made her gasp, a vision of herself standing, but she wasn't alone. Behind her, in the fractured reflection, was another figure. Tall, its limbs contorted in unnatural angles, its eyes glowing like sickly lanterns. It was smiling. A smile that wasn't a smile at all, but something more horrifying. Something wrong. The smile widened, and for the briefest of moments, Sarah thought she could hear the faintest sound, the crunch of bones cracking, the scrape of claws against the floor, and then, laughter. It wasn't her own laughter, and that's when she realized. The mirror wasn't just a reflection. It wasn't just showing her a glimpse of the creature. It was showing her another version of herself, a version of her that had never existed, a shadow of the one who had entered the house with a different intention, a different fate. But in that moment, she knew it was more than a vision. It was a warning. The creature's hand was almost upon her. She reached out in desperation, scrambling for something, anything to escape its grasp. Her fingers brushed against the cold, sharp edges of the glass, but there was no time at all. The world seemed to tilt. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet gave way. And then, in the space of a single breath, everything stopped. The whispers ceased. The cold dissipated. And all that remained was the silence. Sarah opened her eyes. She was no longer in the room. She was standing in a completely different place, a different time. The air was thick with the scent of earth and old wood. She was outside. No longer in the decaying mansion, but somewhere else. Somewhere that felt just as ancient, just as suffocating. The ground was uneven beneath her feet, the dirt soft and damp, as though it hadn't been disturbed in centuries. Above her, the trees stretched their long limbs toward the sky, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers. The leaves fluttered in a non-existent breeze, and the silence, that crushing, oppressive silence, seemed to press in from all sides. And in the distance, she could see it. The house, But it wasn't the same house. It was newer, younger, but it carried the same eerie presence. It was as though it had always been there, waiting for her to return. She felt a chill run down her spine. "It's not over," a voice whispered in her mind. She turned, desperate to find the source of the voice, but the world around her was empty. There was no one there. Nothing. Only the faint sound of footsteps behind her, echoing from the shadows, growing closer. "Come back to us," the voice continued. "We have always been waiting for you." And for the first time, Sarah realized the truth of it. The house didn't just want her to come inside. It wanted her to stay. The figure, the creature from the mirror, was right. She wasn't the first to come here, and she wouldn't be the last. Chapter 8. The Return of the Forgotten. Sarah's breath was shallow, her pulse pounding in her temples as she stood on the threshold of the house that had now become something more than just a place. The silence enveloped her, pressing in on her, heavy and suffocating. The footsteps behind her had stopped, but the sense of being watched, of being waited for, lingered in the air like a thick, oppressive fog. The house loomed before her, not quite as it was before, but still the same. It was as though the walls had been reshaped, stretched into a darker, more sinister version of their former selves. The windows were now dark, like hollow eyes, staring blankly at her. The door, once welcoming, now seemed like the maw of a beast, gaping wide, daring her to step closer. The voices came again, low, indistinct, just on the edge of her hearing. "Come in." There was no hesitation in the command, no question. It was an order. And though she knew that to obey would be her downfall, her feet moved forward of their own accord. Every step she took was heavier than the last, as though the very ground beneath her was sucking her in, pulling her deeper into the house's unholy grasp. She reached the door. It opened. The hinges creaked, a long, drawn-out sound that echoed through the stillness like a warning bell. Inside, the darkness was thick and suffocating, but there was something else, something different about it. A presence lingered in the air, something that had been waiting, something that knew her. The atmosphere was charged with a palpable energy, and the walls seemed to pulse with it. As Sarah stepped inside, she felt a shiver run down her spine. The house hadn't just changed. It had shifted, as though it had reawakened, recognizing her presence, reacting to her as though she were the missing piece in a puzzle it had been trying to complete for decades. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she slowly made her way down the dimly lit hallway. Each step sounded louder in the silence, as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. The walls were lined with portraits, faces of people long dead, their eyes following her, never blinking, their expressions frozen in time. They were all staring at her, judging her, knowing her. She stopped at one portrait, a painting of a woman who looked strangely familiar. The woman's features were soft, yet her eyes, they were hollow, as though something vital had been drained from her long ago. There was a faint smile on the woman's face, but it wasn't kind. It was cruel, mocking, like someone who knew a terrible secret. Sarah reached out to touch the frame. As her fingers brushed against the glass, a jolt of cold electricity shot through her hand, and she recoiled in pain. The image in the painting seemed to ripple for a moment, as though the woman had moved, and then it stilled again, returning to its former state. But the smile, it remained, twisted and distorted, as though it had been waiting for her. Her heart raced. She couldn't stay here. But before she could turn away, a voice echoed in her mind. "You have seen her before." The words were clear now, their meaning unmistakable. Sarah froze. The voice, it was familiar. She knew that voice. But where had she heard it before? Her mind scrambled, searching for the memory, but it was buried deep, just out of reach. "You have seen her before." It repeated in her mind like a chant. A sudden chill swept through the hallway, cold enough to make her breath fog in the air. Something shifted in the shadows. She turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Just the stillness, just the oppressive quiet. And then, from deep within the house, a door creaked open. A gust of wind, icy and sharp, blew through the house, rustling the old curtains like the wings of a bird. The air felt wrong, wrong in a way that couldn't be explained. Sarah's eyes darted toward the source of the noise. The door at the far end of the hall stood ajar, its edges barely visible in the darkness beyond. The faintest light seeped through the crack, casting long shadows on the floor. "It's calling me," she thought, her heart hammering in her chest. "It knows me." Her feet moved, but her mind screamed for her to stop. She couldn't go back. She couldn't leave. The house had already claimed her, and there was no escaping it now. She stepped forward, the distance between her and the door narrowing with each step. The closer she got, the more the air seemed to thicken, pressing in on her, making it harder to breathe. The door was there, just in front of her now, the faint glow from within spilling out like an invitation, or perhaps a warning. She hesitated. But then, the door creaked open fully, as though beckoning her inside. The room beyond was small, a narrow space that seemed to stretch far beyond the confines of the house. It was a room that shouldn't have existed, as though the very fabric of reality had been warped, twisted by something older than time itself. The walls were lined with bookshelves, ancient and worn, their contents unreadable, their spines covered in a thick layer of dust. In the center of the room was a chair, an old, ornate thing, its upholstery cracked and faded with age. But it wasn't empty. Sitting in the chair was a figure that Sarah knew, the woman from the portrait. She was no longer a painting. She was flesh, sitting in the chair, her eyes empty, her smile now a grotesque rictus of a grin. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her hands, those delicate long fingers, were clasped together in her lap, the bones visible beneath the thin flesh. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "You've finally come." The voice was soft, too soft, like the rustling of dry leaves in a forgotten corner of the world. It was the same voice she had heard before, the same voice that had whispered in her mind. You have seen her before, but it was no longer a question. It was a statement, a truth. The woman's eyes flicked up to meet Sarah's. They were hollow, dark pits of nothingness. "Welcome home," she whispered. And as Sarah stepped into the room, the door slammed shut behind her. Chapter 9. The Binding of Souls. The room felt colder now, the air thick with a malevolent force that pressed down on Sarah's chest like a weight she couldn't escape. The door had slammed shut with such finality that she was certain there was no way back, no way to undo what was unfolding before her. The woman in the chair, no, the thing in the chair, smiled at her, the grotesque expression twisting her face into something unrecognizable. "I've been waiting for you, Sarah," the voice purred, its tone far too familiar, too intimate. "You've always been mine, haven't you?" Sarah's pulse hammered in her ears as she took an instinctual step backward, her legs trembling beneath her. Her mind screamed for escape, but her body refused to obey. Every muscle was frozen in place, like she was caught in some invisible web spun by an ancient creature. The shadows in the room seemed to move, stretching out across the walls like dark tendrils that sought to pull her in, to suffocate her. The woman's smile deepened, the edges of her mouth stretching impossibly wide, as though her face was cracking open at the seams. The light flickered, casting long, erratic shadows on the walls, distorting the shape of the figure sitting before her. "Do you remember me, Sarah?" The woman's voice was soft, almost mocking, but there was a cruel undertone to it, as if she were savoring every moment of Sarah's horror. "Do you remember how you promised you would return?" The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Promised? She had promised nothing. She didn't even know this thing. And yet, deep within the recesses of her mind, something stirred. A memory, faint and broken, began to crawl its way to the surface, like a shadow that had been lurking just beyond her awareness, biding its time. She closed her eyes, shaking her head, trying to push the thought away, but it clung to her like a stain, the memory refusing to be erased. There was a time when she was just a child, when the world was simpler and everything felt safe. Her parents were still alive, their faces smiling, their arms around her as they sat together in the warmth of their home. But there was something more, something darker, that lingered at the edges of those memories. An old house, a cold wind, and a figure standing in the distance watching her. We've been waiting for you a long time." The words pierced her thoughts, and suddenly the room was no longer just a room. It was a place she had been before, a place that had never left her, no matter how much she had tried to forget it. The walls, the shadows, the portraits of people with dead eyes, they all came rushing back, and she realized with a sickening certainty that this house, this accursed place, was tied to her in ways she couldn't understand, and perhaps didn't want to. The woman stood up slowly, her movements unnaturally fluid, like a marionette on strings that had been pulled too tight. Her long, thin fingers reached out towards Sarah, the smile still plastered on her face. "It's time to make things right." The words were cold, final, and as the woman's fingers brushed against Sarah's cheek, a sharp pain shot through her skin, as though her very soul was being torn apart. It wasn't just the touch that hurt, it was the feeling that came with it. A deep, suffocating sense of belonging, of ownership. Something that reached down into her very core, making her feel like she was being claimed. "You can't escape it, Sarah," the woman whispered, her lips close to Sarah's ear. "You were born into this. You can't run. You never could." Sarah tried to scream, but the sound was caught in her throat, strangled by the force of whatever was happening to her. The room seemed to spin, the shadows closing in from all sides. The woman's laughter echoed through the chamber, a sound that was both mocking and triumphant, as though she had already won. "You remember now, don't you?" the woman crooned, her voice honey-sweet but full of malice. "You were always meant to come back. You were always mine." Suddenly, the walls around Sarah seemed to bend and warp. The paintings, the ones she had passed earlier, now moved, their eyes following her every movement, their faces twisting into grotesque caricatures of joy and despair. They were laughing, mocking her, and the sound blended with the woman's laughter, filling the room with a cacophony of terror. Sarah's heart raced. She couldn't breathe. The air was thick with something dark and ancient that pressed against her chest, making it harder and harder to think. She felt trapped in this nightmare, unable to move, unable to escape. "It's too late, Sarah," the woman said softly. "You've always been ours. You just didn't know it until now." The truth slammed into Sarah with the force of a tidal wave. The memories, fragments that had been locked away for so long, rushed forward, and she saw it all. Her parents, their faces distorted in terror as they had tried to escape this place, this thing. But it had already been too late for them, hadn't it? And now it was too late for her. The woman, the thing, wasn't just some entity. She was a part of Sarah's past, a part of the dark history that had always been a shadow over her life. Sarah had been born into this curse, this twisted legacy. She had been marked from the very beginning, her fate sealed long before she had even understood what was happening. The house was not just a place, it was a prison, and she was its prisoner. "No!" Sarah gasped, forcing herself to speak despite the crushing weight of the room. "I won't let you have me!" Her words were defiant, but they felt empty in the face of the woman's endless gaze. The figure reached out again, her fingers brushing Sarah's neck with icy precision. "You already belong to us," the woman whispered, her lips curling into a smile that made Sarah's blood run cold. "You were always ours, and now we shall be together forever." A sharp pain shot through Sarah's body, and the world around her seemed to snap, breaking apart at the seams. The darkness that had surrounded her began to bleed into her very being, twisting her thoughts, her consciousness. She could feel herself slipping away, losing herself to the overwhelming force that was taking hold of her. Her vision blurred. The last thing she saw before everything faded to black was the woman's smile. Chapter 10. The last breath of the living. The darkness was absolute. A suffocating, oppressive void that consumed everything. Thoughts, memories, identity. Sarah felt herself falling, not downward, but into the very heart of something ancient, something far beyond the comprehension of human minds. Time no longer existed. The minutes, the hours, the days, they all blurred into one long, timeless stretch of nothingness. Her body felt like it was disintegrating, as though the very essence of her being was being unraveled by some unseen force. Her limbs felt weightless, her heart a distant, erratic beat she could barely sense. But the woman's laughter, the thing's laughter, still echoed in her ears, reverberating in the deep, cavernous silence that surrounded her. "You can't run from it." The voice was a whisper now, but it was everywhere, inside her mind, inside her soul. It was the only thing she could hear, the only thing she could feel. "You were always ours, don't you see? It's your fate." Fate. The word hung in the air like an unspoken curse. Sarah had fought it, denied it, resisted it with every ounce of strength she had. But now, in the crushing darkness, in the face of the woman's cold, inevitable truth, Sarah realized that it was never her choice. The past had already been written. The future had already been sealed. She was merely a player in a game that had been set in motion long before she ever came into existence. Her mind spiraled, the memories that had been buried deep within her surfacing with frightening clarity. She was just a child again, standing in front of the house, the old house, the place she had sworn she would never return to. Her parents had tried to protect her, tried to shelter her from the dark presence that haunted their lives, but it was too powerful. It had always been there, lurking just beyond the edges of their existence, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now, the time had come. Her breath hitched in the darkness, the cold air brushing against her skin like 1,000 icy fingers. She could feel her body again, though it felt like it belonged to someone else, as though her very skin was a stranger. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She tried to scream, to fight back, but it was as if her body no longer had the strength to move. Why, she thought, why had it chosen me? The answer, as it always had been, was simple. It had chosen her because she was always meant to be its. Her existence was never truly her own. The woman, the thing, had been waiting for this moment, for Sarah to return, for Sarah to finally realize the truth, that she was a part of something far older, far darker than anything she had ever imagined. A flicker of light pierced the void, a single fragile sliver of brightness that cut through the darkness like a knife. Sarah reached for it instinctively, her hand outstretched, her fingers trembling as she sought that light. But as she reached, the light seemed to pull away from her, always just out of reach, always fading the closer she got. "You can't escape." The voice again, but it was no longer just a voice. It was a presence, a force that surrounded her. That was her. It seeped into her very bones, making her feel like she was losing herself, becoming something else. "You were never meant to escape. You were meant to return." Sarah's chest tightened, her breath becoming shallow as the world around her seemed to collapse. The light was gone now, swallowed whole by the darkness. The room, the house, seemed to be closing in on her, the walls pressing in from every direction, suffocating her, as though she were being swallowed whole by the very place that had once been her sanctuary. But there was no escape. There never had been. "Don't you understand?" the voice whispered, now strangely gentle, almost tender. "We've always been waiting for you. Always." A sudden pressure in her chest made Sarah gasp for air, her vision swimming as the air around her seemed to constrict. The weight of the woman's words, the thing's words, pressed down on her like an unbearable burden. It was too much. She was drowning in it. "You can't hide from the truth, Sarah. You are ours. You always were." A warmth, disturbingly familiar, began to spread through her veins. It was like the heat of an old forgotten memory, one that had been locked away for so long that it felt alien, but also intimate. As the warmth spread, she felt herself being pulled in every direction, as though the very fabric of reality was beginning to tear around her. The world began to shift. Her surroundings faded and warped, and Sarah was no longer sure of where she was. Was she still in the house? Or had she crossed over into something else, something beyond? A single chilling thought pierced her mind, as sharp and as clear as glass. "This is where I was always meant to be." And then, in a sudden rush, the darkness consumed her completely.